It began with a strip of dirt carved into the jungle, a place no one outside a handful of Japanese engineers had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was just another island among the Solomons, a stepping stone on their march toward Australia. To the Americans who watched from across the Pacific, it was a threat, a dagger pointed straight at the fragile lifeline connecting the United States to the South Pacific. In July 1942, an American reconnaissance aircraft flying over the island reported something unexpected glinting through the trees, the beginnings of an airfield. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Ernest J. King studied the photographs in silence. The Japanese were building a base from which they could strike the sea routes to Australia, threatening every Allied convoy, every supply ship, every plan for the Pacific. America could not allow it. "We'll take the damn place," King said finally. It would be the first American offensive of the war, the first time the United States would seize, not defend. The problem was that no one was ready. The U.S. Marine Corps, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor and the chaos of the Philippines, had never launched a major amphibious assault. The men who would be sent were barely trained, their equipment untested, their maps incomplete. Their commander, Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, received his orders on short notice: capture and hold Guadalcanal. His division, the 1st Marine Division, many of them farm boys and mechanics from small towns, had been training in the steaming jungles of New Zealand for a campaign none of them understood. They called it Operation Watchtower. To the planners in Washington, it was a strategic necessity. To the Marines, it was a leap into the unknown. They had no idea what awaited them in the jungle. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the largest amphibious force yet assembled by the United States steamed toward the Solomon Islands. Dozens of transports, destroyers, and cruisers, escorted by the carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, cut through the dark waters. The men aboard could smell the land before they saw it, the heavy, earthy scent of jungle carried by the wind. "It looked like any other green island until the guns started," one Marine later wrote. At 0600, the sky lit up. The naval guns opened fire, hurling shells into the tree line. Columns of smoke rose from the shoreline as landing craft churned toward the beaches. The Marines crouched inside the Higgins boats, rifles across their knees, faces pale under their helmets. "This is it," someone whispered. The ramps dropped and the men splashed into knee-deep water, the air thick with cordite and fear. But the enemy did not fire. When the Marines pushed inland, they found only stunned Japanese construction workers and a few guards. The airfield, half-built, its runways raw and muddy, was abandoned in haste. The Marines captured crates of food, tools, and documents written in Japanese. It felt unreal. "We thought we'd landed on the wrong island," one corporal said. "There was no fight." By noon, the Americans controlled the airfield. They would later name it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The first U.S. flag to fly over Japanese-held territory rose above the jungle that afternoon, snapping in the breeze. It was the first time since Pearl Harbor that the rising sun had been pushed back. The men cheered, but their commanders were uneasy. At sea, the situation was already changing. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the invasion fleet almost immediately. In the darkened operations rooms of Rabaul and Truk, alarm bells rang. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, could hardly believe it. Americans, attacking first. The Empire's undefeated run since December 1941 was being challenged. He ordered an immediate counterattack. That night, as the Marines dug foxholes around Henderson Field, the first Japanese aircraft appeared overhead. The air was filled with the shriek of bombs and the whistle of steel. The ground shook. Men threw themselves flat as explosions tore through the trees. It was the beginning of what the Marines would call the Nights of Hell. The next day, worse news arrived. The U.S. Navy, fearing Japanese counteraction, withdrew the transport ships prematurely, leaving the Marines with only a fraction of their supplies. Half their ammunition was still on board the departing vessels. Rations were low, medical supplies almost non-existent. When Vandegrift learned the ships were gone, he swore under his breath. "We're on our own," he said. The Marines began to dig in. They laid barbed wire, built machine gun nests, and turned captured Japanese materials into makeshift defenses. They repaired the airfield by hand, filling craters with shovels and sandbags. "We didn't know it yet, but this little airstrip was going to decide everything," one Marine recalled. They were right. The Japanese response was swift and brutal. Within days, ships from Rabaul began unloading troops on the far side of the island. Men of the Ichiki detachment, elite soldiers sent to crush the Americans and retake the airfield. They were told the U.S. landing was small, perhaps a few hundred men. "We will attack and drive them into the sea," their commander, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, told his officers. On August 21st, his 900 troops advanced through the darkness toward the marine perimeter along the Ilu River, known to the Americans as the Tanaru. At dawn, they attacked. What followed would shatter Japan's illusion of invincibility. The Marines waited until the enemy was close, so close they could see their bayonets glint in the early light, and then opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, and rifles tore through the charging ranks. The Japanese charged again and again, shouting banzai as they fell by the hundreds. By morning, the sandbanks of the river were littered with bodies. Of Ichiki's force, fewer than 100 survived. Ichiki himself committed suicide, burning his regimental flag. For the first time in the Pacific War, an entire Japanese unit had been annihilated. In Tokyo, the news was buried. Official reports spoke of fierce resistance, not defeat. But within the Imperial Navy, whispers began. Who were these Americans who had taken an island and held it? Who were these Marines who fought to the last bullet and refused to retreat? On Guadalcanal, the men didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just trying to survive. The jungle was closing in. The heat was unbearable, the mosquitoes constant, and the food already running low. "If the Japanese don't get us, the island will," one Marine muttered. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the ground that would change the Pacific forever. The rising sun had reached its furthest edge. From here, it would begin to fall.
The rain never stopped. It fell in sheets that blurred the jungle into a wall of green and gray, soaking rifles, clothes, and bones. Foxholes became rivers, boots filled with mud, and the air reeked of rot and diesel. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield. It was alive, hostile, and hungry. Every man who fought there soon learned that the island itself was the enemy. By late August 1942, the U.S. Marines had been on Guadalcanal for 3 weeks. They held a narrow perimeter around the half-finished airfield, Henderson Field, a patch of mud that was both their lifeline and their curse. Day and night, the sound of hammers mixed with the distant rumble of surf as the men worked to finish the runway. They had no heavy machinery, only shovels and sweat. When the first American aircraft landed on August 20, a squadron of Marine F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless bombers, the men cheered and wept. For the first time, they had eyes in the sky. They called it the Cactus Air Force. But Japan was coming back. In Rabaul, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was furious. The loss of the Ichiki detachment had been a humiliation, one the Imperial High Command could not ignore. Guadalcanal was not just a patch of land, it was a matter of pride, and pride was the fuel of empire. Reinforcements were ordered. The Japanese 17th Army, under General Harakichi Hyakutake, was assigned the task of retaking the island. The first convoys sailed immediately, carrying thousands of fresh troops, artillery, and supplies. To the Americans on the ground, the signs were unmistakable. Each night, the horizon flashed with distant gunfire as Japanese destroyers, the dreaded Tokyo Express, raced down the slot, the narrow sea channel that cut through the Solomons. They came in darkness, delivering men and supplies, and vanished before dawn. Then, at daybreak, the air attacks began. The Marines learned to read the sky. The deep drone of engines announced incoming Zero fighters and G-4M Betty bombers from Rabaul. Every day, Henderson Field was bombed and strafed, its planes set ablaze, its runways cratered. And every night, Japanese cruisers and destroyers shelled the perimeter with clockwork precision. The men came to call it the washing machine Charlie routine, the nighttime bombardment that shook the ground and shattered sleep. We lived in the dirt. We fought in it, ate in it, slept in it. You stopped caring about being clean. You just wanted to wake up alive. By early September, the Japanese had landed a fresh force, the Kawaguchi Brigade, veterans from Malaya and Borneo. Their orders were clear: retake Henderson Field at any cost. On the night of September 12, 1942, they attacked. Rain fell hard, turning the slopes south of the airfield into rivers of mud. The Japanese advanced silently, barefoot, carrying grenades and bayonets. Their objective was a ridge defended by a mixed group of Marines and paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike, Edson's Ridge. The position would later be called Edson's Ridge, though to the men who held it, it was hell. At 9 p.m., the jungle erupted. Flares lit the night as Japanese soldiers stormed uphill, screaming banzai. The Marines fired until their barrels glowed red. Grenades burst among the trees. Mortar shells whined overhead. The line bent, nearly broke, and then held. Edson moved through the chaos, calm, cigarette clamped between his teeth. "Hold the line, boys. Hold it, or we'll all die here." They held. By morning, the slope was carpeted with bodies. Over 800 Japanese lay dead. The Marines had lost 40 men and twice that wounded, but Henderson Field was safe. It was the second time Japan had thrown an elite force against the airfield and lost it entirely. The psychological tide began to shift. For the first time in the war, American troops had stood toe-to-toe with Japan's finest and won. "We knew right then that they could bleed," one Marine sergeant recalled. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The men were starving. With supply ships forced to turn back under air attack, food dwindled to almost nothing. Marines ate rice, maggot-ridden Japanese rations, or whatever they could catch. "We were hungry all the time," one corporal wrote. "If you found a can of peaches, you were rich." Malaria spread through the camps. Men shivered with fever, their skin yellow, their eyes hollow. "The living were as thin as the dead," a Navy doctor wrote. Every night the rain returned, and every night they listened for the sound of engines, the Tokyo Express, bringing more men to kill them. In Tokyo, the newspapers told a different story. The Imperial Army's communique spoke of a small enemy force surrounded and annihilated. But among Japan's officers, doubts began to creep in. The Americans were not supposed to fight like this. They were supposed to be soft, weak, untrained. Yet these Marines, soaked, starving, and surrounded, refused to yield. By the end of September, the Japanese had lost nearly 4,000 men on Guadalcanal. The Americans had fewer than 12,000 left fit for combat. The island had become a grinder, consuming lives on both sides. Still, neither would let go. On October 1st, another massive air raid struck Henderson Field. Bombs tore open the runway, destroyed fuel dumps, and sent planes tumbling like toys. For hours, the air was filled with fire and black smoke, yet by the next morning, the Marines had patched the runway again, by hand, with dirt and wreckage. When the first Dauntless lifted off at sunrise, the men on the ground cheered weakly. "You can't kill cactus," someone muttered. It was true. The field survived. The men endured. And the Japanese, watching from across the sea, realized something terrible. This was no longer a war of swift conquest. It was a war of attrition. By mid-October, General Hyakutake prepared one last assault. He massed 20,000 men for a decisive strike on Henderson Field. "We will crush them," he promised. But his troops were sick, starving, and exhausted from weeks in the jungle. The Marines waited behind sandbags and wire, their machine guns zeroed in, their artillery pre-sighted. The battle would come soon, and when it did, the fate of Guadalcanal, and perhaps the Pacific, would be decided.
By October, Guadalcanal had become a single word whispered with dread in both languages. To the Japanese, it was a bleeding wound that refused to close. To the Americans, it was a test of endurance, a place where survival itself had become victory. The skies above the island were thick with black smoke. The jungles stank of rot and gunpowder, and the waters that surrounded it had already earned a new name from the sailors who fought there: Iron Bottom Sound. Every night, the sea burned. On the first days of October 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, decided to make Guadalcanal a proving ground for Japan's might. The defeat of the Ichiki detachment and the failure of Kawaguchi's attack had wounded the Army's honor. Yamamoto's answer was simple: crush the Americans with overwhelming force. 3 carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho, would provide air cover while battleships and cruisers shelled the American positions into dust. The Army would then launch a new ground offensive to annihilate the garrison and retake Henderson Field. But the Americans had no intention of yielding. Admiral William Bull Halsey, newly appointed commander of the South Pacific, sent word to every ship and pilot within range: Guadalcanal must be held. There is no second choice. On the island itself, the men could hear the distant thunder of naval guns. We didn't know who was winning out there, but every night something burned. The Japanese offensive began on October 13, 1942. Just after midnight, 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, slipped through the darkness off Guadalcanal's northern coast. At 1:30 a.m., they opened fire. For 83 minutes, they hurled nearly 1,000 14-inch shells onto Henderson Field. The bombardment was apocalyptic. Aircraft exploded on the ground, fuel tanks burst into fireballs, and entire sections of the runway vanished under geysers of flame and steel. It felt like the end of the world, a merry pilot remembered. We just lay in our foxholes with our hands over our heads and waited to die. By dawn, the airfield was a smoking ruin, but the Americans refused to abandon it. Ground crews worked furiously through the day, filling craters, salvaging wrecked planes, and welding together what could still fly. By afternoon, the first fighters of the Cactus Air Force were back in the air, battered, smoking, but still flying. The Japanese Army, believing the airfield destroyed, began its next assault. The battle for Henderson Field began on October 24th. General Hyakutake's 17th Army, nearly 20,000 strong, launched a series of attacks from 3 directions. Their goal: overrun the Marine perimeter and recapture the airstrip. But Hyakutake's intelligence was weeks old. His soldiers, half-starved, racked by malaria, and drenched from the constant rain, stumbled through swamps and jungle ravines in the dark. Many never reached the battlefield at all. When the assault began, it came in waves. Under a curtain of rain, Japanese troops charged screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai" through mud and wire. The Marines answered with machine guns, mortars, and point-blank artillery. The jungle erupted with flame. "They just kept coming," one Marine said. "You could see them in the lightning flashes, bayonets glinting. We fired until the barrels glowed red. They never stopped moving until they fell." For 3 days, the fighting raged around the airfield. On the 3rd night, the Japanese broke through briefly, only to be driven back by tanks and shotguns in hand-to-hand combat. At dawn on October 26th, Hyakutake ordered a retreat. Over 3,000 of his men lay dead in the mud. The Marines, half dead from exhaustion, walked the battlefield in silence. They were lying on each other like logs. There was no victory here, just survival. While the ground burned, the sea roared. On October 26th, as Hyakutake's army reeled on the island, the carrier forces of both nations clashed in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the fourth major carrier engagement of the Pacific War. It was a brutal, evenly matched fight. Japanese dive bombers hit USS Hornet with devastating accuracy, leaving her a burning wreck that had to be scuttled. The Enterprise, riddled with bomb damage, fought on with flight crews working knee-deep in fuel and blood. But Japan paid dearly for its success. It lost 100 aircraft and many of its most experienced pilots, men who could never be replaced. "We won the battle," one Japanese officer wrote, "but we lost the war in the air." For the Americans on Guadalcanal, that sacrifice was life itself. With the Japanese air threat diminished, the Cactus Air Force regained dominance over the skies. For the first time, American planes could strike Japanese convoys by day, sinking transports and destroyers as they tried to reach the island. Yamamoto's dream of victory was slipping through his fingers. November brought the final reckoning. Japan made one last desperate attempt to deliver reinforcements and destroy Henderson Field. On November 12th, a massive convoy of transports approached under heavy escort. American reconnaissance spotted them, and Admiral Daniel Callahan's cruiser group moved to intercept. What followed was one of the most chaotic and violent naval engagements in history, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Just after midnight, on November 13th, under the light of a full moon, two fleets stumbled into each other at point-blank range. In seconds, the night exploded into fire. Ships rammed, collided, and exchanged broadsides at distances so close, sailors could see the enemy's faces lit by the flashes of their own guns. The air was filled with screams, explosions, and the metallic shriek of tearing steel. The U.S. flagship San Francisco was hit 45 times. Admiral Callahan was killed on the bridge. The Japanese battleship He took dozens of shells before finally going down in flames the next day. Both sides were bloodied beyond recognition. 2 nights later, another battle, even larger, raged in the same waters. American battleships Washington and South Dakota faced off against Kirishima and a screen of Japanese destroyers. Radar guided the U.S. gunners through the dark. Washington's shells found their mark, pounding Kirishima until she rolled and sunk, taking hundreds of men with her. By the end of November 15th, the sea was littered with wreckage and oil slicks. Both fleets were shattered, but the Japanese transports had been destroyed before they could unload their troops. The army on Guadalcanal was doomed. In 6 months, Japan had lost 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and nearly all of its carrier-borne air groups. The ocean that had once been its highway of conquest was now a grave. The tide of war, once flowing east, had turned west. On Guadalcanal, the Marines watched the sun rise over Iron Bottom Sound, the smoke still hanging low on the horizon. "The Navy held," one Marine said simply. "That's all that mattered." But in the Japanese camps across the island, the truth was spreading like disease. Food was gone. Ammunition was gone. The Tokyo Express could no longer reach them. The men began to whisper a new name for Guadalcanal: Starvation Island. And soon, starvation would become the final weapon.
By December, Guadalcanal was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard that breathed. The jungle hid the dead, the rivers carried their ashes, and the air reeked of sickness and decay. The once proud soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, who had stormed across the Pacific with bayonets raised and banners flying, now crawled through the mud on hands and knees, their bellies empty, their uniforms in tatters. The empire that had roared into history now whispered through fevered mouths, "We are starving." The Americans could hardly believe what they saw. After months of brutal combat, the Japanese resistance had not collapsed in a grand battle. It had simply withered. Patrols pushing west from Henderson Field found abandoned foxholes, rusted rifles, and bodies so thin they seemed carved from sticks. "They were ghosts," one Marine said. "You could see the shape of their bones under their skin." The men who still lived
clung to the last scraps of discipline. They boiled roots, chewed leaves, and even ate leather straps from their packs. Many died with the rifle still across their chests, eyes open, staring into the canopy. Others slipped away into the jungle and never returned. The Japanese called Guadalcanal Gekitsushima, Starvation Island. For the Americans, the misery was only different, not less. The Marines had been reinforced by the U.S. Army's Americal Division and the 25th Infantry Division, bringing their numbers to over 40,000. But food was still short, the weather still merciless, and disease still everywhere. Malaria had bitten nearly every man on the island. The average soldier had lost 20 pounds. "We didn't walk anymore, we shuffled," one private wrote. Yet the Americans had one thing the Japanese did not: supply. Every week, convoys from New Caledonia and Espiritu Santo arrived under the protection of U.S. carriers and destroyers. Cargo ships unloaded crates of ammunition, sea rations, and mail, letters from home that smelled faintly of soap and coffee. For the first time since the landings in August, the Marines knew they could win. Across the island, the lines shifted slowly westward. The U.S. advance was cautious, methodical. The jungle was a maze of ambushes and snipers. Every ridge and streambed had to be taken by hand. At night, the rain never stopped. Men dug into soaked foxholes and listened to the distant rumble of surf and the occasional cry of a dying soldier somewhere in the dark. For the Japanese command at Rabaul, the situation had become untenable. Admiral Irasuku Yamamoto had sent thousands of men and dozens of ships into the maw of Guadalcanal, and nothing had returned but loss. The Army's 17th Division was reduced to half strength, its regiments scattered. Supplies no longer reached the beaches. American aircraft from Henderson Field attacked every convoy that dared approach. Destroyers sent on Tokyo Express runs arrived with nothing more than sacks of rice. On December 31, 1942, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters made the unthinkable decision. The Emperor's army would withdraw from Guadalcanal, not in defeat, at least not publicly, but in strategic relocation. The word retreat was never spoken aloud. The operation was given a code name, K, meaning to rescue. While Japan prepared in secret, the Americans pushed forward relentlessly. Each new ridge was another hill of death. The Battle of Mount Austin in late December marked one of the campaign's last major clashes. Japanese defenders entrenched in cave networks resisted for days under artillery and flamethrowers. When the Marines finally reached the summit, they found dozens of enemy soldiers dead by their own hand, their positions still immaculate, their flags still fluttering in the damp wind. By January, the Japanese army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The survivors, barely 10,000 men, huddled in the western jungles near Cape Esperance, awaiting rescue that most believed would never come. They were too weak to fight, too proud to surrender, and too loyal to admit defeat. On the nights of February 1 to 7, 1943, under cover of darkness and rain, the Japanese Navy made its move. A fleet of destroyers slipped down the slot, running without lights or radios. American patrols spotted them briefly, but assumed they were another supply run. In 3 nights of perilous work, the destroyers evacuated nearly 10,000 soldiers, emaciated, fevered, some too weak to climb the ladders, and hoisted aboard like bundles of sticks. It was one of the most skillful and tragic operations in naval history. The Japanese called it a success. In truth, it was a funeral procession. By dawn on February 9, 1943, Guadalcanal was silent. The jungle no longer echoed with the sounds of battle. Only the hum of insects and the distant buzz of American aircraft circling overhead. When American patrols reached the last Japanese positions, they found nothing but corpses, empty helmets, and broken rifles rusting in the rain. At Henderson Field, General Alexander Vandegrift sent a simple message to headquarters. Guadalcanal is secure, the enemy has fled. The 6-month battle was over. The cost was staggering. Japan had lost 31,000 men, 3/4 of those sent to the island. The U.S. had suffered 7,100 dead, but the difference was not just in numbers. It was in momentum, in will. Guadalcanal had drained Japan's elite pilots, its best ships, and its faith in victory. In Tokyo, Admiral Irasuku Yamamoto read the reports in silence. He understood what his staff could not yet say aloud. The empire had reached its high-water mark. Every mile gained after this would be a mile lost elsewhere. Japan had awakened a nation whose power lay not in its armies, but in its factories and its shipyards, and its endless supply of men who would keep coming until the Pacific itself ran out of space. For the Americans on the island, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. They buried their dead, cleaned their rifles, and stared at the jungle that had tried to kill them. "It's over," one Marine said, "but it doesn't feel like it." The rain kept falling. The jungle swallowed the wreckage, and the airfield, once fought over by thousands, became quiet again, just another patch of earth beneath the Pacific sky. But history had shifted. Guadalcanal was no longer a name. It was a turning point. The rising sun had reached its limit, and from the mud and blood of that island, a new tide began to rise, one that would roll all the way to Tokyo Bay. The war in the Pacific did not stop when Guadalcanal fell silent, but the sound of that silence carried farther than any artillery. On February 9, 1943, as the last shots faded and the jungle swallowed the echoes, the balance of the Pacific shifted forever. Japan had not just lost an island, it had lost the initiative, the faith of its soldiers, and the illusion of its invincibility. Across the Pacific, in Washington, a telegram arrived at the Navy Department. Guadalcanal is secure. The message was short, almost understated, but its meaning was vast. It marked the end of Japan's expansion and the beginning of America's long, relentless march west. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the news was victory. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, read the report in his office at Pearl Harbor. He looked up at his staff and said quietly, "This is the turning point. From now on, we push." And they would push, across the Solomons, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, and eventually to Okinawa itself. But every campaign that followed carried the shadow of Guadalcanal. For the Japanese, the retreat was a wound that never healed. Officially, Tokyo called it a strategic withdrawal, a redeployment to new positions. Unofficially, it was a defeat so severe that the government censored all mention of it in newspapers. Letters home from surviving soldiers were confiscated. The public was told that operations were continuing as planned. But among the officers who had seen the island, no lie could disguise the truth. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, who had commanded the 8th Fleet during the campaign, summarized it bluntly in his final report. The enemy's strength and resources were greater than expected. Our losses are unrecoverable. Guadalcanal has drained the blood of the Navy. He was right. Japan had lost more than 31,000 men, 38 ships, and 700 aircraft. But the numbers told only part of the story. The Empire had bled away its finest, its best pilots, its most experienced sailors, its most disciplined infantry. The men who replaced them were brave, but untrained fighters, and they would go to war in aircraft and ships built hastily, poorly, and always in fewer numbers than America could produce in a single month. Admiral Izuruko Yamamoto, who had planned Pearl Harbor and watched the tide turn against him, received the news with stoic resignation. "The moment we lost Guadalcanal, we lost the war," he reportedly said. For the Americans who fought there, the cost was equally heavy. 7,100 dead, over 7,000 wounded, and thousands more crippled by malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. But for all the pain, Guadalcanal had given them something the early months of the war had not: belief. The Marines who had landed in August as half-trained, half-equipped rookies left in February as veterans. They had faced Japan's best soldiers and survived. They had held Henderson Field against waves of bayonets, endured shelling, hunger, and disease, and somehow kept fighting. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep going in its presence. When the 1st Marine Division finally left the island, gaunt and hollow-eyed, they marched past rows of new troops arriving to replace them. One officer watching the procession later wrote, "They didn't look like men, they looked like ghosts who'd crawled out of hell." Yet when those ghosts boarded the transports for home, the bands on deck played Waltzing Matilda and Stars and Stripes Forever. For the first time in the Pacific War, America's heroes were not myths. They had names, faces, and scars. Guadalcanal's importance could not be measured in square miles of jungle or runways of coral. Its true value lay in time and momentum. The 6 months of savage fighting had bought the Allies the one thing they needed most: time to build. While Japan bled itself dry over a single island, American factories roared to life. In 1942, the U.S. produced 48,000 aircraft. In 1943, it built 86,000. New carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Yorktown II, slid off assembly lines faster than Japan could name them. The industrial machine that Yamamoto had feared was now fully awake, and it would not sleep again until Tokyo burned. Guadalcanal was proof that America could fight, supply, and sustain a campaign across an ocean thousands of miles away. It tested the new logistics system: naval convoys, mobile airfields, floating repair docks, that would become the backbone of the Allied advance. The lessons learned there would be repeated at Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima. For Japan, Guadalcanal's legacy was spiritual as much as strategic. The soldiers who escaped the island carried home tales that contradicted years of propaganda. They spoke of American artillery that never stopped, of planes that appeared from nowhere, of a navy that could fight every night and still return stronger. They spoke of Marines who didn't surrender, of pilots who crashed their burning planes into enemy columns rather than bail out. In private, some Japanese officers began to wonder if they had misjudged their enemy entirely. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, one of the Empire's most respected naval strategists, wrote in a post-war memoir, "We believe the Americans lacked the will to fight, that their material abundance would soften them. At Guadalcanal, we learned we were wrong. They fought as if every inch of ground was their homeland." That realization spread through the ranks like a slow infection, the understanding that the Empire had awakened something far greater than it had anticipated. On the island itself, nature reclaimed the scars. By the end of 1943, vines crept over the wrecks, and rainwater filled the craters. The rusting hulks and tanks and landing craft became part of the landscape, monuments to a war barely over,
but already turning to legend. Henderson Field remained, its runways expanded and strengthened. Planes continued to take off from the same coral strip that men had once died defending, now carrying supplies farther west, to Bougainville, to New Guinea, to the Philippines. The Marines called it the Island of the Dead, but they also called it the island that changed everything. In February 1943, a few days after the final Japanese evacuation, Time magazine published a cover story, "Victory on Guadalcanal, the Turning of the Tide." It showed a map of the Pacific and an arrow pointing west toward Tokyo. It was more than optimism. It was prophecy. From that moment onward, the Pacific War became an American advance. Every battle, every landing, every victory could trace its lineage back to one forgotten island and the men who refused to die there. Guadalcanal was never meant to be the place where the world turned. It was an accident of geography, a patch of jungle chosen for an airfield no one finished. But fate has a way of hiding history's hinges in the mud. The empire that had risen with the sun began to set there. And from the coral and rain of Guadalcanal, a new light began to rise, fierce, unrelenting, and unstoppable. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back again.